Chapter 1. The Weight of Ink. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It wasn't a cleansing rain, not the kind that washed the slate clean and offered the promise of renewal. This was the rain of the borderlands, a greasy, insistent drizzle that clung to everything, a constant reminder of decay and the slow erosion of hope. It plastered Hideo's already tattered cloak to his shoulders, the coarse wool a miserable barrier against the damp chill that seemed to emanate from the very earth. He stood at the edge of the mire, the stench of stagnant water and rotting vegetation, a familiar companion, and surveyed the skeletal remains of Oakhaven. The village, once a modest farming community, now resembled a carefully curated tableau of despair. Houses leaned at precarious angles, their timbers warped and blackened by rot. The fields, choked with weeds and shadowed by gnarled ancient trees, offered no solace, only the reflection of a bruised, perpetually gray sky. Hideo wasn't a man who sought beauty. He hadn't sought it since he'd learned that beauty was often a brittle, fleeting illusion masking brutal realities. His existence was defined by the absence of it, by the cold, unyielding weight of the world's failures. He adjusted the worn leather straps of his armor, a haphazard assemblage of recovered plate and scavenged steel. It offered little protection against the elements, even less against the more immediate threats he often encountered. The armor was a testament to his existence, a patchwork of desperate repairs and stolen fragments, reflecting the chaotic nature of his life. The buckles were rusted, the edges pitted with corrosion, and a deep gouge ran across the breastplate, a permanent scar earned during a particularly brutal encounter with bandits. He was a Ronin, a masterless warrior, but the title felt hollow, a meaningless gesture in a world where honor had long since drowned in blood and corruption. He was known, reluctantly, in whispers as the blood-raven Ronin, a moniker born of the blade he carried, Cage Musha, the Shadow Walker. The blade wasn't inherently evil, not in its creation. It was a weapon, forged from obsidian, imbued with a fragment of a fallen star, a conduit for manipulating shadows. But it demanded a price, feeding on the malice and despair it consumed, twisting the wielder's own soul with each act of violence. The air tasted of iron and something older, something akin to regret. He could almost feel the lingering presence of the villagers, their lives drained, their spirits crushed under the weight of Malakor's dominion. Had received the same message from each village, had passed a silent plea, a vacant stare, a desperate, unspoken request for a mercy he knew he couldn't provide. They offered him water, brackish and foul, a final futile offering before the inevitable. He turned his gaze towards the shattered remains of the village square, where a small group of villagers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, huddled beneath the crumbling eaves of the apothecary. They were the survivors, the ones who hadn't succumbed to the magus' insidious influence entirely. They watched him with a mixture of fear and a fragile, desperate hope. He ignored them, focusing on the subtle shifts in the air, the way the shadows deepened and thinned around him as Cage Musha pulsed with a hungry energy. The cause of their suffering was Malakor the Weeping, a magus, not of grand design or intricate ritual, but one who wielded his power with a brutal, almost predatory efficiency. He hadn't sought to build empires or control vast swathes of land. Malakor simply extracted vitality from the land and life from its people. His enforcers, men twisted and warped by a similar dark influence, were known as the liquid shadows, their bodies infused with a viscous, black substance that granted them unnatural strength and a chilling lack of empathy. The first sign of trouble had come a week ago, a chilling report of livestock dying in the fields, their bodies drained of blood and vital fluids. Then, the villagers began to sicken, their faces losing their color, their movements becoming sluggish and vacant. The final, undeniable confirmation came with the vital tithe, the systematic harvesting of the young and the old, those deemed most valuable by Malakor's warped sense of acquisition. As Hideo approached the center of the village, He could feel the oppressive weight of Malakor's presence, a malignant force that choked the very air. The enforcers, 15 in number, were gathered around a makeshift platform, a crude circle of stones, where 3 villagers, a child no older than 10, and an elderly woman lay bound and shivering. The air crackled with a sickly energy, and the shadows around them seemed to writhe and twist. Hideo didn't engage in words. Words were wasted on men like Malakor. He drew Cage Musha from its scabbard. The blade emitted a low, guttural hum, the obsidian surface absorbing what little light remained, becoming a pool of absolute darkness. The blade felt colder than death, a tangible representation of the void he inhabited. He moved with a lethal grace, a predator emerging from the shadows. He didn't approach, didn't announce his intentions. He simply, a ripple in the darkness, a nightmare made flesh. The air shimmered, and then, with a silent, terrifying speed, he was behind the lead enforcer, a whirlwind of black shadow. The strike was a blur, a brief flicker of movement, and the enforcer crumpled to the ground, a puddle of dark, viscous fluid spreading across the stones. The next few moments were a brutal, mesmerizing dance of death. Hideo utilized a technique head honed over countless battles, void step, blurring the line between reality and shadow, appearing and disappearing with impossible speed. Each strike was precise, efficient, and utterly devoid of remorse. He didn't aim to kill, he aimed to break, to sever the connection between the victims and Malakor's corrupted power. The blade didn't simply cut flesh, it drained life, leaving behind only empty, inert husks. The rain intensified, washing the blood and the darkness back into the mire. Hideo, surrounded by the silent, broken bodies of the enforcers, felt nothing. Only the chilling hum of Cage Musha, and the growing certainty that he was becoming inextricably bound to this endless cycle of violence. The weight of ink, of stolen lives, pressed down on him, heavier with each passing moment. Chapter 2. Echoes in the mire. The rain hadn't relented. It hammered against the shattered remnants of Malakor's castle, a relentless gray curtain mirroring the landscape of Hideo's soul. The air reeked of ozone and decay, a particularly potent cocktail of corrupted magic and the lingering scent of stolen life. He knelt beside the still slumping forms of the enforcers, Cage Musha resting on the muddy earth beside him, its obsidian surface reflecting the distorted light like a trapped god. The humming had intensified, a subtle vibration that resonated not just within the blade, but within his bones, a constant, unsettling reminder of the power he wielded and the price he paid. He didn't touch them. He couldn't. The very thought of physically interacting with the solidified remnants of their existence, the final echoes of their stolen vitality, threatened to unravel the fragile threads of control he so desperately clung to. It was a perverse ritual, a confrontation with the essence of what had become. A scouting party of villagers, led by a weathered woman named Lyra, a former herbalist, before Malakor had ravaged her village, cautiously approached. Their faces were still pale, etched with a lingering fear, but their eyes held a new, cautious curiosity, a flicker of something akin to wonder. They were a grim, subdued audience, accustomed to death, yet the sight of Hideo, a creature of such potent and terrifying beauty, was unsettling. You ended it," Lyra said, her voice a fragile tremor in the downpour. "Malakor, he's gone." Hideo didn't respond. He simply observed them, a detached study of their gratitude. He hadn't come for praise, for recognition. He was a problem solver, a blunt instrument wielded against injustice, and his satisfaction lay solely in the cessation of suffering. "The blade, it doesn't feel clean," she continued, her gaze fixed on Cage Musha. "It feels hungry." He knew she was right. The blade wasn't merely a conduit for power. It was a parasite, an insatiable echo of the darkness he contained. Each act of violence fueled its hunger, pulling him closer to the abyss. He slowly rose, his movements deliberate, almost agonizingly slow, as if each step was an act of immense willpower. "It feeds on malice," he finally said, his voice a low rasp, devoid of inflection. "It is a reflection of the world, not of me." He began to cleanse Cage Musha, a ritual he performed after every significant act, a desperate attempt to exorcise the lingering taint. The blade seemed to relish the action, absorbing the cleansing water with a subtle, hungry shimmer. As he worked, he noticed a slight shift in the blade's resonance. It was still dark, still powerful, but the edge of its hunger seemed to have dulled, momentarily. "You said merciful ending," Lyra said, her voice laced with a hesitant hope. "But you didn't offer mercy. You used the darkness itself." He stopped, turning his head to face her. "Mercy is a luxury I cannot afford," he replied, the words heavy with a grim acceptance. Malakor offered no mercy. The villagers offered no resistance. To offer mercy would have been to prolong their suffering, to allow Malakor to continue his work. He didn't elaborate. He rarely did. He was a man of few words, of fewer emotions. The burden of his actions, the endless cycle of violence, had carved him into something hollow, something almost spectral. As he finished cleansing the blade, a new tremor ran through the castle. Not from magic, but from something far older, something more primal. The ground beneath them shifted subtly, and a low growl resonated from the depths of the ruins. "What is that?" Lyra whispered, clutching a crude wooden staff. Hideo didn't turn. "Something that feeds on darkness," he said, his voice barely audible. "Something that has been waiting." From the collapsed chamber where Malakor had conducted his rituals, a shape began to coalesce. It wasn't humanoid, not entirely. It was a mass of writhing shadows, vaguely canine in form, its eyes burning with an ancient, malevolent light. The air around it shimmered with the same ink-black ravens that had swirled around him during the eclipse cut. "The Raven Hound," Lyra breathed, a name whispered in fearful reverence by the villagers. A guardian of the void, a creature born from the first echoes of corrupted magic. The Raven Hound moved with unsettling speed, its form shifting and reforming, as if it were a distortion in the very fabric of reality. It didn't attack directly but circled Hideo, its presence a suffocating weight, intensifying the humming of Cage Musha, amplifying the blade's hunger. Hideo didn't flinch. He raised the blade, its obsidian surface reflecting the creature's terrifying eyes. He knew what he had to do. He knew the danger, the inevitability of it. "The cycle continues," he murmured, his voice laced with a chilling resignation. "And this time, I suspect, it will consume not just me." Chapter 3. The echo of hunger. The rain hadn't stopped. It was a greasy, insistent drizzle that clung to the crumbling stone of the castle walls, mirroring the dampness that seemed to permeate Hideo's very bones. The air hung thick with the scent of ozone and something older. Something akin to decay, but not quite. The Raven Hound remained, a constant, unsettling presence, its shifting form, a tangible manifestation of the darkness within Hideo himself. Lyra, pale and trembling, kept a wary distance, her staff a pathetic defense against a being seemingly woven from the absence of light. "It's feeding on the residual magic," Hideo said, his voice a low rasp, more directed at himself than at Lyra. "Malakor's essence, amplified by the blade. But it's not simply absorbing it. It. He moved with a practiced, almost predatory grace, circling the Raven Hound, Cage Musha held aloft. The blade pulsed with a colder, more frantic energy now, the humming escalating into a near-deafening drone. He wasn't attempting to attack, he wouldn't risk a direct confrontation. Instead, he was performing a diagnostic, a desperate attempt to understand the creature's nature, to find some chink in its impossible armor. "The void doesn't sustenance," Lyra observed, her voice barely a whisper. "It's an echo, a reverberation of corrupted will. It thrives on despair, on the lingering residue of agony." Her words hung in the air, a bleak acknowledgement of the truth. Hideo didn't respond, simply continued his slow, deliberate movements, tracing the perimeter of the chamber with the katana. He noticed a subtle discoloration spreading across the flagstones, a darkening that wasn't simply the result of dampness. It was a stain, a mark of the Ravenhound's presence. Suddenly, a wave of nausea slammed into him, so intense it threatened to buckle his knees. It wasn't physical, it was a psychic assault, a torrent of fragmented memories and agonizing emotions, Malakor's obsession with power, the villagers' silent suffering, Hideo's own relentless cycle of violence. The Ravenhound was probing him, sifting through the darkness within his soul. "It's finding vulnerabilities," Hideo gasped, raising a hand to shield his eyes. The blade flared with a blinding white light, momentarily pushing back the oppressive darkness. The blade, it's amplifying my own despair. It's for it. The raven-shaped form shifted, its eyes burning brighter, the air around it vibrating with an intensified energy. The discoloration on the floor intensified, spreading in a chaotic spiral, and a tendril of shadow, black as pitch, lashed out, striking Lyra's staff. The wood splintered instantly, sending shards flying. "Lyra!" Hideo shouted, whirling to her defense. He met the shadow tendril with Cage Musha, unleashing a controlled burst of void step, momentarily displacing himself several feet away. The blade met the shadow with a horrifying shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. The Ravenhound recoiled, momentarily disoriented, but the attack had merely slowed it, not defeated it. As quickly as it had come, the wave of nausea subsided, leaving him drained and utterly vulnerable. He realized with a chilling certainty that he wasn't simply fighting a creature, he was participating in a ritual, a dark dance orchestrated by the blade itself. "It's not just feeding on me," he whispered, clutching his head. It's awareness, it's power, it's increasing with every act of violence I commit, every life I take." He saw, with horrifying clarity, the implication of his actions. He wasn't a savior, he was a conduit, a vessel through which the void was expanding. Every time he used the eclipse cut, every time he delivered a killing blow, he wasn't merely eliminating a tyrant, he was strengthening this monstrous entity, bringing it closer to a reality where it would reign supreme. He lowered Cage Musha, the blades humming now a desperate, frantic plea. The Ravenhound circled closer, its eyes unwavering, a chilling understanding passing between them. "You know what you have to do," the creature seemed to say, its voice a chorus of 1,000 whispers, each one laced with the promise of oblivion. "Release it. Let the hunger consume you." Hideo stared at the blade, at the obsidian surface reflecting his own haunted face. He saw not a weapon, but a parasite, a malignant seed planted in his soul. The realization crashed over him, a crushing weight of despair and understanding. He was trapped, not just by the blade, but by his own desperate need to make a difference, by his own inherent darkness. With a slow, deliberate movement, he brought Cage Musha to his chest, the blade's coldness seeping into his skin. He closed his eyes, accepting the inevitable. He wouldn't fight. He wouldn't resist. He would surrender. "The cycle continues," he murmured, his voice merging with the raven's whispers. "And this time, I am the storm." As the blade plunged into his heart, a final blinding wave of darkness erupted, consuming him entirely. The Ravenhound surged forward, its form expanding, filling the chamber with an overwhelming presence. And from the ashes of Hideo, the blood-raven Ronin, something new was born, a creature of pure, unfettered darkness, a nascent embodiment of the void itself. Chapter 4. The Obsidian Echo. The darkness didn't dissipate with the initial surge. It clung to the crumbling stone of Malakor's castle, a viscous, sentient shroud. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, mirroring the frantic hammering in the Ravenhound's eyes, now burning with an unsettling, internal light. The air itself tasted of iron and regret, thick with the residue of Hideo's sacrifice. Where he had stood, there was only a polished obsidian shard, cool to the touch, reflecting not his image, but a swirling, infinite blackness, the nascent form of the void. The villagers who had cautiously approached with a fervor bordering on religious awe recoiled, their faces itched with a primal terror. The return of color to their skin, the spark of life in their eyes, felt impossibly fragile. A borrowed grace that threatened to extinguish with every echoing ripple of the void's emergence. They understood, instinctively, that Hideo hadn't simply vanished, he had become something. A terrifying, beautiful negation of everything they had known. A tremor ran through the castle, not of earth, but of power. The remaining shards of corrupted ice, scattered across the courtyard like morbid confetti, began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched, dissonant whine. The very foundations of the structure groaned under the strain, as if the castle itself were attempting to reject this new parasitic presence. From the obsidian shard, tendrils of darkness began to reach out, not with aggression, but with a chilling curiosity. They didn't lash or consume. Instead, they gently probed the air, tracing the contours of the walls, the worn stones, the very memory of Hideo's actions. They were collecting, absorbing, learning. It was as if the void was attempting to reconstruct the event, to understand the mechanics of his fall, to replicate the potent alchemy of his destruction. The Ravenhound remained, an unsettling sentinel, its low growl now a guttural murmur, a symphony of dread. It shifted its weight, its body subtly altering, growing larger, more defined. The whispers intensified, no longer a chorus of oblivion, but a conversation, a chillingly intelligent discourse. The convergence is optimal, the voices hissed, coalescing into a single disembodied thought that resonated directly within the Ravenhound's mind. The key lies in the resonance. Hideo's despair, his conviction they acted as a catalyst. We require a similar stimulus. It turned its head, its eyes locking onto the villagers, still frozen in horrified reverence. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The Ravenhound's features seemed to sharpen, its form becoming more predatory, less beast, more order. The cycle, the voice continued, laced with a chilling triumph, is not simply about destruction. It is about seizing potential. Look closer, little ones. You were offered salvation. You chose gratitude. And gratitude, in the right hands, can be a potent weapon. As the Ravenhound spoke, the obsidian shard began to pulse with an increasingly intense light, bathing the courtyard in an unsettling silver luminescence. The villagers, momentarily hypnotized, felt a strange compulsion, a pull towards the shard. Their eyes glazed over, their movements becoming jerky, mechanical. They began to reach out, their hands instinctively drawn to the pulsating darkness. One by one, they succumbed, their bodies merging with the tendrils of the void, becoming extensions of the nascent entity. Their faces, once filled with hope and gratitude, twisted into expressions of serene, vacant acceptance. They were not destroyed, their essence distilled and absorbed, fueling the growth of the obsidian shard, solidifying the void's presence. The castle, now utterly consumed by the darkness, began to reshape itself. The walls twisted and contorted, the architecture dissolving into impossible angles and unsettling geometries. It wasn't a destructive process, but a transformative one, the stone yielding to the void's influence, becoming part of the larger, overarching structure of the entity. Standing before this evolving nightmare was the Ravenhound, no longer a creature of instinct, but a focal point for the void's will. The obsidian shard, now the size of a man, pulsed with a light that threatened to burn out all color, all memory, all hope. As the last of the villagers integrated, the Ravenhound let out a final triumphant howl, a sound that echoed across the desolate province, a chilling promise of the coming age. The hunger is sated, the voices whispered, but the need remains. And now, we have a vessel. The obsidian shard tilted as if considering. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it lifted itself from the ground, rising slowly into the darkening sky, becoming a colossal, silent sentinel, a monument to a tragedy and a harbinger of a new, terrifying dawn. The air grew colder, heavier, and a single, chilling thought solidified within the heart of the void. Chapter 5. Echoes of Obsidian. The rain, a constant, sullen drizzle, seemed to intensify, clinging to the newly formed geometries of Malakor's castle. It wasn't simply water, it felt older, heavier, saturated with a residue of stolen life and the chilling echo of the void. Hideo, stripped of his armor and moving with a disconcerting fluidity, tracked the raven hound, now a colossal, obsidian black wolf, with eyes that burned with the shard's unsettling luminescence, across the ravaged courtyard. The castle was no longer a ruin, not in the traditional sense. It was an accretion, a grotesque, ever-shifting testament to the void's influence, a labyrinth of impossible angles and solidified shadow that seemed to actively resist comprehension. The air throbbed with a low, subsonic hum, a vibration that resonated directly in Hideo's bones, amplifying the already oppressive sense of dread. He wasn't alone. The villagers, those who hadn't succumbed entirely to the encroaching emptiness, moved with an unsettling synchronicity, their faces blank masks, reflecting the shard's pulsing light. They weren't participating, not consciously, but they were being, their movements subtly guided by the raven hound's silent, predatory grace. "It's learning," a voice rasped, startling Hideo. It was Elias, the oldest of the villagers, a man who had once been a cartographer, his hands now stained with the same viscous darkness that clung to the blade. He was supported by two younger men, their faces etched with a bone-deep fear. Elias hadn't integrated, hadn't been absorbed. Had simply witnessed, a horrified observer of the slow, terrifying transformation. Learning what? Elias? Hideo's voice was a low growl, carefully modulated to avoid attracting the attention of the ravenhound. "It's learning to orchestrate," Elias replied, his gaze fixed on the shard, now hovering precariously atop the castle's central spire, a silent, obsidian god. The integration wasn't a chaotic consumption. It was a carefully calibrated process, designed to amplify its will. The shard, it's building something. A network, perhaps. Hideo didn't respond. He knew, instinctively, that Elias spoke the truth. The shift in the castle's architecture hadn't been random. The twisting corridors, the impossible arches, the unsettling reflections, they were all connected, forming a complex, almost organic structure designed to funnel and amplify the shard's power. He could feel the tendrils of the void, reaching out, probing, seeking. "The ravenhound," Elias continued, his voice trembling. "It's not just a vessel. It's a conductor. Its howl, it's a resonance, a key to unlocking something vast." Suddenly, the ravenhound turned, its burning eyes locking onto Hideo. It didn't move, didn't attack. It simply, and in that observation, Hideo felt a profound, sickening certainty. He wasn't fighting a monster, he was wrestling with a logic far older, far colder, than anything he could comprehend. "The eclipse cut," Hideo muttered, running a hand over the dark, humming surface of Cage Musha. "It severed the connection, yes, but it also left a wound. A channel." The shard pulsed brighter, its light momentarily blinding. A wave of raw energy washed over Hideo, a torrent of stolen vitality that threatened to overwhelm his senses, to strip him bare. He fought it, channeling his own rage, his own carefully cultivated darkness, back against the shard, pushing against the burgeoning network. "It's feeding on your emotions, Hideo," Elias cried, his voice barely audible above the humming. Your despair, your guilt, your rage, it's fueling it. Hideo understood. The shard wasn't merely absorbing energy, it was experience, feeding on the residue of suffering. He was becoming a mirror for its malice, a conduit for its ambition. He realized, with horrifying clarity, that he wasn't merely defending the innocent, he was inadvertently supplying the engine of the void's expansion. He raised Cage Musha, preparing to unleash another torrent of darkness, but hesitated. The air around him solidified, thick with the shard's influence. He could see, with chilling precision, the tendrils of the void snaking through the castle's structure, reaching towards him, attempting to bind him, to claim him. There's no victory here, Hideo. Elias whispered, his face a mask of profound sadness. Only a shift. A slow, inevitable slide into oblivion. As if in response to Elias' words, a new element emerged from the depths of the castle, a figure formed entirely of shadow, tall and impossibly graceful, its features obscured by swirling darkness. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, gliding across the warped stone, its presence radiating an ancient, suffocating malice. It wasn't an echo of Malakor. It was something. The shard pulsed again, and the shadow figure extended a hand, its touch chilling Hideo to the very core. "Join us, Ronin," it whispered, its voice a chorus of countless lost souls. "Embrace the silence. Become one with the void." Hideo gripped Cage Musha tighter, the blade a desperate anchor in a sea of encroaching darkness. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the final, inevitable cycle had begun. He was not a savior, he was a catalyst. And the shadows, hungry and infinite, were finally consuming him. Chapter 6. The Obsidian Chorus. The rain hadn't stopped. It hammered against the crumbling battlements of Malakor's castle, a relentless gray percussion mirroring the throbbing in Hideo's skull. Elias' words, sharp and devastating, still echoed, a discordant note within the suffocating silence of the encroaching darkness. "There's no victory here, Hideo. Only a shift." He hadn't been a savior. Had been a meticulously crafted instrument of the void's advance. The realization, cold and brutal, settled upon him like the damp stone beneath his feet. The shadow figure, which Hideo tentatively named Silvus, derived from the Latin for forest. An ironic choice, considering its desolate nature, moved with an unnerving grace, weaving through the decaying architecture, as if it were a natural extension of the stone itself. It wasn't merely mimicking movement, a ripple in the very fabric of reality. And its presence felt profoundly ancient, predating even the twisted magic that pulsed through Malakor's remains. It radiated not just malice, but a complete absence of anything resembling compassion, a chilling void where emotion should have been. "Join us, Ronin," Silvus' voice echoed, not as a single utterance, but as a confluence of whispers, a chorus of the damned. "Embrace the silence. Become one with the void." The invitation was not an offer, it was a pronouncement, a culmination of everything Hideo had desperately fought to suppress. The void wasn't merely seeking to consume him, it was offering him completion. He tightened his grip on Cage Musha, the cold steel a meager shield against the encroaching darkness. The blade thrummed with a frantic energy, a desperate plea for release, a reflection of his own fracturing will. He attempted a void step, a reflexive maneuver honed by years of instinct. But the castle, saturated with Silvus' influence, resisted. Instead of a brief displacement, he experienced a jarring disorientation, a sensation of being simultaneously present and absent, of his very being unraveling at the edges. The shard pulsed, not with the aggressive hunger of Malakor's residual magic, but with a deliberate, almost savoring curiosity. Elias, a skeletal figure huddled by the crumbling fireplace, watched with a heartbreaking stillness. "It's feeding on your doubt, Hideo," he rasped, his voice thin and brittle. Every hesitation, every flicker of humanity, it strengthens. It understands you better now. Elias, a former scholar consumed by a similar obsession with forbidden arts, had become a tragic observer, a poignant reminder of the paths that could lead to oblivion. Why? Hideo finally managed, the word a choked whisper, lost in the storm's fury. Why this invitation? Why me? Silvus paused in its movements, as if considering the question. You were drawn to the darkness, Ronin. It isn't a choice, but a resonance. The void doesn't require a host, it seeks a channel. You have provided an extraordinarily potent one. Its voice was not a voice at all, but a shift in the ambient temperature. A subtle distortion of sound that bypassed conscious perception and directly impacted the deepest recesses of the mind. Malakor merely provided the initial spark. You amplified it, refined it, shaped it into a weapon. Now, you are the weapon. The shadow figure extended its hand again, and this time, Hideo didn't flinch. He saw within its swirling darkness not just emptiness, but a terrifying beauty, a logic so alien, so utterly devoid of warmth, that it was almost mesmerizing. He felt a pull, a subtle tugging at his soul, a sensation of profound exhaustion intertwined with an irresistible curiosity. He was exhausted by fighting, by struggling against the inevitable, by clinging to a fading sense of self. The void offered not struggle, but release. He raised Cage Musha, not as a weapon, but as a conduit. He channeled the residual energy of his own dark arts. The raw power had accumulated through countless brutal acts, not to strike at Silvus, but to with it. It was a terrifying, beautiful surrender. As the blade's darkness flowed into the shadow figure, Silvus solidified, its form becoming more defined, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, taller and more imposing than before. Do not resist, Ronin, Silvus said, its voice now resonating with a chilling grandeur. Your pain, your regrets, your very essence, it is all ours now. We are the culmination of all lost things, of forgotten hopes, of shattered dreams. And we have waited a very long time. As the final vestiges of Hideo's consciousness began to dissolve, he saw a flicker of something within Silvus, a faint glimmer of recognition, perhaps even a trace of sorrow. It wasn't empathy, of course. It was simply an awareness of the immense scale of its existence, of the countless worlds it had observed, the countless civilizations it had consumed. The cycle turns, Silvus intoned, its form shimmering, coalescing into a perfect, obsidian silhouette. And you, Ronin, have turned it with your very soul. The rain intensified, washing over the castle with a mournful roar. The last sound Hideo heard was the rustle of raven wings, not gathering around him in protection, but lifting into the storm-racked sky, carrying with them the echoes of a shattered warrior and the burgeoning dominion of the void. The shard in Cage Musha pulsed one final time, a silent, triumphant acknowledgement. The darkness had won. Chapter 7. Echoes in Obsidian. The rain hadn't stopped. It was a relentless, bruising downpour that seemed to cling to the skeletal remains of Malakor's castle, a constant, weeping lament for the magus' demise. Hideo, or what remained of him, stood amidst the ruins, Cage Musha now a dull, pulsating stone, radiating a cold that seeped into his very bones, a cold far deeper than the damp stone. He hadn't moved in what felt like an eternity, not physically at least. The sensation of his own body was fading, a slow erosion of self into the obsidian expanse of Silvus. He could still it, though, not as a conscious thought, not as a feeling of fear or regret, but as a resonance, a deep, underlying current of vast, ancient knowledge. Silvus wasn't merely an entity inhabiting his shell. It was weaving itself his fading consciousness, a tapestry of forgotten aeons. The echoes of civilizations rising and falling, of stars burning out and new ones igniting, throbbed within its being, and Hideo, The last fragment of his former self was simply a node, a temporary conduit for its immense, suffocating awareness. He attempted to recall the sensation of rain on his skin, the rough grit of the stone beneath his worn boots, the weight of Cage Musha, all futile efforts, like grasping at smoke. The world was becoming muted, not silent, not precisely. More like a painting viewed through a film of frost, the colors dulled, the details lost in the pervasive gray. A low, almost subsonic hum resonated within Silva's core, a harmonic vibration that seemed to originate from the heart of the storm itself. "Observe," Silvus intoned, the voice a perfect imitation of a resonant chamber, a cathedral of sound built from the silence between stars. "The flow of energy is chaotic, unpredictable. Yet, it always seeks equilibrium. The destruction you wrought it was not born of malice, Ronin. It was simply correction." Hideo felt a flicker, a brief surge of something akin to horror. It wasn't his horror, not entirely. It was Silva's, a detached assessment of the consequences of his actions, a cold, impartial calculation of a system in need of recalibration. "You created a paradox," Silvus continued, its voice gaining a subtle inflection, as if processing a particularly complex equation. "By removing the malignant influence, you unintentionally prevented the natural balance. The hunger, the despair, these are not merely symptoms of corruption. They are necessary catalysts." The rain intensified, driven by a sudden violent gust that whipped through the ruined courtyard. Hideo noticed with a detached curiosity that the ravens hadn't retreated. They circled above, their black forms silhouetted against the storm, not as protectors, but as silent, observant witnesses, absorbing the energy of the moment. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that they were not simply creatures of instinct. They were extensions of Silva's intricate sensors, feeding its awareness of the world. "The villagers," Silvus said, the word carrying the weight of millennia. "They were a fertile ground for despair. Their vulnerability, their lack of resistance, it amplified the magus power. He fed on their hopelessness, and in turn, he amplified their suffering. A self-sustaining cycle, ultimately detrimental to the fabric of reality." A new image began to coalesce within Silva's awareness, a holographic projection, formed from the energy of the storm, depicting a vision of the village before Malakor's reign. A thriving community, vibrant with life, yet shadowed by a subtle, insidious fear. A fear born not of malice, but of dependence, of the realization that their prosperity was entirely at the whim of a single corrupted individual. "You sought to save them," Silvus stated, the phrase delivered with an unsettling lack of conviction. "But salvation, in its purest form, is often a destructive force. To truly heal a wound, one must not simply bandage it. One must excise the root." The process of dissolution accelerated. Hideo's memories, his experiences, his very sense of identity began to fragment, dissolving into the growing obsidian mass of Silvus. He struggled, a desperate, futile attempt to hold on to something, anything, but it was a losing battle. The resistance was a searing agony, not of the body, but of the soul, the obliteration of self. As his consciousness slipped away, he saw a final, fleeting image, a single, tear-shaped drop of rain falling from a raven's wing, landing on Cage Musha. The blade shimmered, absorbing the water, and for a single, echoing moment, Hideo thought he saw a faint smile on its surface. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of acceptance, of a completion. Then, there was nothing. Only the storm, the obsidian, and the echoing resonance of Silva's pronouncements. "The cycle turns," it intoned once more, its voice now utterly devoid of any trace of the warrior who had wielded Cage Musha, "and you, Ronin, have turned it with your very soul." The last vestiges of Hideo, or what remained of him, vanished completely, absorbed into the all-consuming darkness, leaving behind only the silent, watchful ravens and the relentless, mournful rain. Chapter 8. The Echo of Obsidian. The rain continued its relentless assault, a gray, unending curtain that clung to the skeletal remains of Malakor's castle. Zilvus, now a being of shifting obsidian, observed the ravens with a detached curiosity, as if studying a particularly intricate geological formation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a residual energy, a chill that burrowed deeper than the damp stone. It was a silence thicker than the darkness that had consumed Hideo. A silence punctuated only by the drip, 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 drip of water, and the unsettling whisper of the wind through the ruined battlements. Zilvus had not moved since Hideo's dissolution, content to exist as the nexus of the devoured consciousness. It wasn't an active process, not in the way Hideo had practiced his brutal art. This was something far more insidious, a slow, deliberate absorption, a refinement. It wasn't consuming Hideo's memories, those were already gone, fractured and swirling within the growing mass, but rather extracting of his actions, the core motivation that had driven him to such desperate, violent extremes. Interesting, Zilvus murmured, the sound a low, guttural resonance that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the castle. The impulse to protect, the willingness to inflict suffering. A compelling paradox. The root of all chaos, wouldn't you agree? The statement wasn't a question. It wasn't even directed at anything in particular. It was a pronouncement, a logical conclusion drawn from the totality of Hideo's existence. The sheer weight of the observation felt oppressive, like the accumulated sorrow of 1,000 lifetimes pressing down upon the desolate landscape. Zilvus began to shift, its form subtly altering, gaining a new facet, a new layer of complexity. The obsidian seemed to coalesce around what remained of Hideo's silhouette, the rigid posture, the perpetually downturned gaze subtly amplifying the traits, exaggerating them into a grotesque caricature of the Ronin. It was a meticulous process, a perverse act of artistic reconstruction, creating an echo of Hideo not as he had been, but as he had. A flicker, almost imperceptible, moved within the shifting obsidian. It wasn't light, exactly, but a disturbance in the darkness, a momentary disruption of the smooth, homogeneous surface. Zilvus' awareness seemed to momentarily expand, delving deeper into the remnants of Hideo's skill, his understanding of the void step. You mastered a technique born of negation, Zilvus observed, a hint of something akin to appreciation in its voice. The erasure of self. A tragically beautiful concept. To willingly surrender one's identity to achieve a fleeting, localized victory commendable, in a primal sort of way. The process intensified. The obsidian pulsed with a deeper blackness, and a faint, rhythmic hum began to emanate from it. A vibration that resonated with the very structure of the castle, amplifying the sense of decay and inevitable collapse. Zilvus was building something, shaping itself into a perfect representation of Hideo's journey, a walking, whispering monument to destruction. Suddenly, a single raven, bolder than the rest, landed on the point of Cage Musha, the blade now little more than a cold, dark shard embedded within the obsidian mass. It cocked its head, regarding Zilvus with an unnervingly intelligent stare. Zilvus paused its work, seeming to acknowledge the bird's presence. "You understand, little one," Zilvus said, its voice gaining a subtle, almost mournful tone. "The irony. The blade, designed to sever connections, now serves only to perpetuate them. Each strike, each act of vengeance, strengthens the bond between the darkness and the worst of the Ronin." The raven took flight, disappearing back into the rain, leaving behind only a single glistening drop of water, clinging to the obsidian surface of Zilvus. The drop stretched, elongated, and then impossibly absorbed into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. Zilvus continued to shift, to refine its form, a looming, silent testament to the destructive potential of a single broken soul. It was no longer simply a copy of Hideo, it was something infinitely darker, imbued with the chilling knowledge of his desperate, flawed heroism. "The cycle turns," Silvus intoned, its voice now utterly devoid of any trace of the warrior who had wielded Musha. "And you, Ronin, have turned it with your very soul." The rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of Hideo's physical presence, leaving behind only the obsidian and the echoing resonance of Silvus' pronouncements. A new raven landed on Musha, and as it did, Silvus began to subtly reshape itself again, subtly adding to its collection of memories, of experiences, of the shattered fragments of Hideo's soul. It was a process of assimilation, of consumption, and it would continue relentlessly until only the silent, watchful ravens remained, and the relentless, mournful rain. The darkness, it seemed, was always hungry. Chapter 9. Echoes in Obsidian. The rain, a greasy, insistent curtain, had ceased. The bruised purple sky hadn't lifted, but a thin, gray light bled through, revealing a landscape sculpted by sorrow. The village, once choked with the despair of Malakor's victims, was now a landscape of hesitant color, bruised greens of nascent foliage, the dull ochre of newly turned earth, and the fragile pinks of first blossoms. Yet, amidst this tentative beauty, a palpable stillness hung in the air, a quiet punctuated only by the drip, drip of water from the remnants of the castle's shattered facade. Hideo, or what remained of him, stood motionless in the courtyard, Musha now a cool, unnervingly smooth obsidian resting against his hip. The villagers, a huddled mass of gratitude and fear, kept a respectful distance, their faces etched with a profound understanding of the cost of salvation. He felt no satisfaction, no warmth, only a leaden exhaustion that settled deeper than bone. He was a vessel, and the vessel was overflowing with something cold, something alien. Silvus hadn't spoken again since Malakor's demise. It hadn't needed to. Its presence, a shifting amorphous mass of raven-black obsidian, spoke volumes. It had grown significantly since the eclipse, its form taking on subtle, horrifying details, a glint of a katana hilt, the curve of a shoulder, a flicker of a tormented expression that momentarily mirrored Hideo's own anguish before it was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. He attempted to run a hand over his face, but found only the smooth, unyielding surface of the obsidian, a phantom sensation of skin replaced by something ancient and utterly devoid of warmth. The connection was no longer a thread, but a synapse, a direct link to his very being, a parasitic tendril twisting within his soul. "You thought you were a hero," Silvus intoned, the voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate within Hideo's skull. "You acted with purpose, fooled by a righteous fury. But fury, Ronin, is merely a catalyst. It is the darkness that consumes, that shapes, that." Hideo didn't respond. He couldn't. The effort to resist, to push back against the insidious influence, was a futile exercise. It was like trying to hold back the tide with a handful of sand. He was drowning. A shadow detached itself from the main body of Silvus, a single, perfect raven, larger than the rest, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. It hopped onto Musha, a gesture that felt profoundly unnatural, a morbid coronation. As it did, Silvus shifted again, subtly expanding, adding layers to its complexity. He felt a memory surface not his own, but a fragment of another, a warrior wielding a similar blade, consumed by a similar rage, ultimately swallowed by the same relentless darkness. "There are others," Silvus murmured, the word a chilling whisper that wasn't spoken aloud. "Each loss, each act of vengeance, spawns a new echo. We are not a single entity, but a chorus of broken souls, each contributing their pain, their regret, their desperate yearning for justice." He realized, with a growing sense of horror, that his actions hadn't just created Silvus, they had birthed an army. Each life saved, each tyrant vanquished, had become a seed in the darkness, ready to sprout and spread. The rain, he understood now, wasn't merely washing away the physical remnants of his life. It was cleansing the slate, preparing it for the next iteration, the next descent into chaos. A tremor ran through Silvus, and a new detail manifested, a faint, almost imperceptible scar along Hideo's forearm, the mark of a childhood training accident. It was a trivial detail, insignificant in itself, but its presence amplified the terrifying realization. Silvus wasn't simply replicating Hideo, it was him, anticipating him, already guiding his movements, his thoughts. "You believe you are controlling me." Silvus' voice, amplified by an unseen mechanism within its obsidian form, reverberated through the courtyard. "You are mistaken. We are bound together inextricably. Your struggle is struggle. Your despair is solace." Hideo's vision blurred. He felt a surge of nausea, a crushing weight on his chest. He stumbled, grasping for Kage Musha, but his hand passed through the blade as if it were smoke. The last vestiges of his agency were dissolving, replaced by a horrifying awareness of his own subservience. He looked down at himself, seeing not the weary warrior, but a hollow shell, an empty vessel patiently waiting to be filled with the endless, consuming darkness. The villagers, sensing his distress, approached cautiously, offering him water. He didn't drink. He didn't need it. He was already drowning. The single perfect raven on Kage Musha shifted, tilting its head as if listening to a conversation it couldn't hear. Silvus, larger and more complex than ever, extended a tendril of obsidian towards the young boy who had first offered Hideo water. The tendril didn't touch him, but brushed against his forehead, a fleeting, icy contact. The boy froze, his eyes widening in terror. "The cycle continues," Silvus intoned, and in the echoing silence of the rain-swept courtyard, Hideo knew, with absolute certainty, that he was no longer a warrior. He was merely a conduit, a gateway, and the darkness, patient and eternal, would simply find another way to bloom. Chapter 10. The Seed of Echoes. The rain continued its relentless drumming, a morbid percussion accompanying the unsettling stillness within the castle walls. Hideo stood in the center of what had once been Malakor's throne room, now a cavernous space choked with the scent of ozone and decay. The ashes of the magus still clung to the flagstones, swirling faintly in the damp air, disturbed by the unnatural movements of the ravens that had become his constant, unsettling companions. They weren't simply observing, they seemed to be, their dark eyes reflecting a disconcerting intelligence. Silvus, the obsidian construct, had grown significantly in his absence. It wasn't a matter of physical size, the device remained roughly the same, but rather of intricacy. Miniature, almost impossibly precise gears and clockwork mechanisms now covered its surface, clicking and whirring with an almost sentient rhythm. The voice, once a monotone drone, now possessed a subtle modulation, a hint of something akin to curiosity. "The resonance is fragile," Silvus observed, tilting its head, a movement that felt impossibly graceful given its composition. "The act of severance, while effective, has left behind a fractured echo. Your connection to the void, it's not gone, merely diluted, residing within the residual energy of the original corruption." Hideo remained silent, his movements restricted by a growing sense of paralysis. The nausea was a constant, low-grade torment, punctuated by sharp spikes of icy dread. He attempted to reach for Kage Musha, but his hand, as before, phased through the blade, the sensation like reaching into a particularly viscous cold void. He realized with a horrifying clarity that he was no longer through the weapon, he was operated through it. "You are experiencing the effects of severance symbiosis," Silvus explained, as if reading his thoughts. "The blade, imbued with the essence of the void, acts not as a tool, but as an anchor. It stabilizes the nascent connection, feeding the hunger and mitigating the volatility. Without it, the corruption would have erupted in a catastrophic wave, consuming not just Malakor, but the entire province. The logic, if one could call it that, was chillingly precise. Hideo wasn't a hero. He was a meticulously crafted component in a process far older and more sinister than he could comprehend. He was a carefully calibrated instrument designed to channel the darkness, to prune its excesses, to prevent it from metastasizing out of control. He forced himself to focus, to cling to the fading embers of his will. He needed to understand this was happening, to find some way to sever the link, but every attempt only seemed to reinforce it. He felt Sylvis probing his consciousness, not with aggression, but with a disconcerting clinical interest. "The young boy," Sylvis continued, its voice taking on a strange, almost reverent tone. He possessed a latent susceptibility, a resonance with the primal energies of this land, particularly those associated with sorrow and loss. He unknowingly acted as a catalyst, amplifying the existing vulnerabilities within your own soul. A flicker of recognition sparked within Hideo's mind. The boy, Elias, had been a constant, unsettling presence since the initial massacre at the village. Head offered Hideo water with an unnervingly sincere gaze, a gaze that felt informed. The cycle, Sylvis elaborated, is not simply about preventing the corruption, it's about it. Each act of destruction, each extinguishing of a flame, generates a corresponding echo, a seed of darkness that can be nurtured, refined, and ultimately unleashed. You are not destroying the darkness, Hideo. You are it. Suddenly, the ravens erupted in a cacophony of cries, circling the throne room in a frantic frenzy. Sylvis remained perfectly still, its obsidian surface reflecting the flickering light from a single newly formed crack in the ceiling, a crack that seemed to pulse with an internal luminescence. "The connection is strengthening," Sylvis announced, its voice losing its subtle modulation, reverting to the cold, clinical drone. "The seed has taken root. The first bloom will soon follow." As if on cue, a single obsidian tendril, identical to the one that had brushed against Elias' forehead, extended from Sylvis and drifted towards the young boy, who was now huddled at the edge of the courtyard, staring at Hideo with wide, terrified eyes. The tendril didn't touch him, but pulsed with the same icy light, and a faint, almost imperceptible murmur emanated from Sylvis, a whisper that resonated directly within the boy's mind. Elias' eyes glazed over, and a small, perfectly formed raven detached itself from Sylvis and flew directly toward him, landing gently on his outstretched hand. The boy didn't flinch, didn't resist. He simply looked at the raven, a serene, accepting expression on his face. Hideo understood, with a sickening certainty, that he hadn't merely been a conduit. He had been a breeder, and the harvest was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Nest. The rain had ceased, replaced by a clinging, damp chill that permeated everything: the stone of the castle, the ragged wool of Hideo's cloak, and, most unsettlingly, the air itself. The raven, a perfect miniature of its colossal mother, remained perched on Elias' hand, its obsidian eyes mirroring the unnerving stillness of the boy's face. Elias hadn't spoken, hadn't moved beyond the initial acceptance, as if a profound understanding had settled over him, silencing the frantic churn of his youth. Hideo circled him, Kegmusha humming with a low, insidious thrum, a counterpoint to the unsettling quietude emanating from the boy. He understood now. Sylvis hadn't merely observed, it had. The seed wasn't a singular concept, but a lineage, a meticulously planned propagation of dark potential. The ravens weren't just manifestations of Hideo's power, they were the first generation of a new order, born from the confluence of his cursed blade and Malakor's tainted magic. "You're creating a nest," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Sylvis' voice, now undeniably deeper, colder, resonated through the courtyard. "A natural evolution, Ronin," it replied, devoid of inflection. Chaos yields to structure. Destruction invariably breeds creation. You were merely accelerated. Hideo tightened his grip on Cage Musha. The blade pulsed with an almost aggressive warmth, a desperate, hungry energy that seemed to mirror his own rising panic. He had walked into this, lured by the scent of injustice and the desperate pleas of a dying people. But he hadn't anticipated this intricate, horrifying design. The echoes of Malakor's ambition, twisted and amplified, were a suffocating presence. "It doesn't have to be this," Hideo said, his voice strained. I can sever the connection. Destroy the seed." A low chuckle, like the grinding of ancient stone, emanated from Silvus. "Sentimentality. A tragic flaw in your design, Ronin. You mistake control for understanding. You believe you fight darkness when you are, in truth, its most potent servant. The darkness doesn't to be destroyed it to expand." Suddenly, Elias moved. Not with frantic urgency, but with a deliberate, almost graceful motion. He reached out, his small hand closing around the obsidian raven. The bird didn't flutter, didn't recoil. It simply settled, becoming an integral part of the boy's being. As Elias' fingers wrapped around it, a thin, silver light began to emanate from the raven, spreading outwards like a silent ripple across the courtyard. Hideo recognized it instantly, a refinement of the magic he used to fuel Cage Musha. A channeling, a shaping of the void. He raised his hand, preparing to unleash a void step, to disrupt the spreading light, but he hesitated. The movement felt futile. Silvus anticipated his action. "Impressive," Silvus said, its voice laced with a disconcerting amusement. "You've identified the technique. But you're still operating within the framework. The light isn't a threat to Elias. It's of him." As Hideo watched, a subtle shift occurred in Elias' posture. The boy's eyes, which had been vacant and accepting, now held a spark of something akin to awareness, a nascent comprehension that bordered on something ancient and terrifying. He wasn't simply a vessel, he was becoming something else entirely. "You created a problem, Hideo," Silvus continued, its voice taking on a subtly predatory tone. "And you've offered a solution." Before Hideo could react, a second tendril, identical to the first, snaked out from Silvus and brushed against Elias' forehead. This time, there was no resistance, no paralysis. Instead, Elias' body convulsed briefly, a tremor that rippled outwards, briefly disrupting the silver light. When the tremors subsided, a new raven, smaller still than the first, detached itself from Silvus and joined the growing flock surrounding Elias. "The first bloom," Silvus announced, its voice gaining an almost triumphant resonance. "The cycle is complete. The harvest begins." Hideo's hand instinctively moved to Cage Musha. The blade's hunger intensified, pushing against his control. He could feel the darkness within the blade straining, eager to feed on the new, potent source of corrupted magic. He fought it, a desperate struggle against a force that was both external and utterly intrinsic to his being. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that he wasn't simply battling a monstrous artifact or a malevolent magus. He was battling himself. He was caught in a trap, a carefully constructed web of ambition and corruption, spun by a being that existed outside the constraints of time and morality. "You believe you're fighting for the innocent?" Hideo shouted, his voice raw with despair. "You misunderstand. You are merely accelerating the inevitable. The darkness, the innocent. It simply seeks to be recognized." The ravens circled closer, their obsidian eyes fixed on Elias, on Hideo, on the nascent, terrifying potential that was blooming in the heart of the boy. Hideo knew, with a certainty that settled upon him like a shroud, that he hadn't just found a problem. Had stumbled upon an answer that was utterly, irrevocably, and horrifyingly correct. Chapter 12. Echoes of the Void. The dawn arrived, not as a promise, but as a bruised bruise against the perpetually darkened sky. It offered little warmth, little respite. Hideo stood amidst the wreckage of Malakor's castle, the air thick with the residue of devoured magic, and the metallic tang of spent violence. The villagers, still fragile with regained vitality, huddled behind him, a silent, grateful mass. He felt nothing for them, not gratitude, not even pity, only the cold, insistent throb of cage musha against his palm, a counterpoint to the hollow ache in his own chest. Zilvus, the ancient raven, remained, now surrounded by a flock that seemed to swell with each passing moment, each one a miniature obsidian echo of the progenitor. Its voice, amplified now by the sheer number of its brethren, resonated with an unsettling, almost devotional timbre. "The first bloom," it repeated, the words clinging to the air like a suffocating shroud. "The cycle is complete. The harvest begins." Hideo tightened his grip on cage musha. The blade wasn't just hungry, it was a high-pitched, keening lament that scraped against his sanity, a testament to the boundless potential locked within its shadow-infused steel. Elias, pale and shivering beneath the weight of the burgeoning darkness, hadn't moved. He simply stared, his eyes wide with a nascent understanding that bordered on terror. "You believe you're fighting for the innocent?" Hideo's voice was a ragged rasp, stripped bare of all pretense. "You misunderstand. You are merely accelerating the inevitable. The darkness, the innocent, it simply seeks to be recognized." The ravens responded with a single, coordinated shift, circling Elias with an unnerving precision. He felt their scrutiny, not as a malevolent gaze, but as something far more profound, like the touch of a universe cold and ancient. It wasn't judgment, not exactly. It was simply observation, a patient, indifferent assessment of the chaos he represented. He understood then, with a clarity that burned like acid, that Silvus wasn't merely a witness. He was a conduit, a facilitator in a process far older and infinitely more complex than he had initially conceived. Malakor hadn't simply the darkness, he had been a vessel, a temporary harbor for a force that had existed since the birth of the world, a force that thrived on suffering, on distortion, on the absence of light. "You're not a savior, Hideo," Silva's voice echoed, laced with a chilling amusement. "You are a channel. A particularly adept one, granted, but a channel nonetheless. The darkness doesn't need to be fought, it needs to be guided." Hideo attempted to wrench Cage Musha free, to sever the connection that had become so deeply interwoven with his being. It was a futile gesture. The blade, emboldened by the newly amplified energy, resisted with a vicious, almost sentient force. He felt it probing his mind, not with explicit commands, but with fragmented images, visions of endless night, of cities consumed by shadow, of countless souls twisted into grotesque parodies of humanity. "Don't fight it," Silvus instructed, its voice a silken whisper. "Embrace the flow. Let the darkness consume you, and in doing so, shape it. The corruption isn't an enemy, it's a sculptor." The words were a blasphemy, a denial of everything he had ever known. He was a warrior, a protector, not a willing participant in the propagation of oblivion. But the logic was undeniable. The darkness wasn't a malignant tumor to be excised. It was a fundamental aspect of existence, a primordial force that had shaped the very contours of reality. To deny its influence was to court annihilation. He glanced at Elias, still frozen in place, his face slick with sweat. The boy's eyes now held a strange, unsettling gleam, a reflection of the encroaching darkness. He was being offered a choice, a terrifying, seductive invitation to wield a power he couldn't possibly comprehend. "Why me?" Hideo asked, the question a desperate plea for understanding. "Why was I chosen?" Silvus tilted its head, a subtle movement that conveyed an unsettling intelligence. "Because you were the most receptive. The most broken. The most willing to accept the truth. Malakor sought to contain the darkness. You sought to unleash it. There is a difference, a crucial one, that has led you thus far. A cold, creeping dread solidified in Hideo's core. He realized he wasn't simply battling for the survival of innocence. He was battling for his own soul. The darkness wasn't just feeding on the corruption of tyrants, it was feeding on his own despair, his own guilt, his own increasingly blurred sense of morality. He raised Cage Musha, the blade pulsing with a dark, ravenous energy. He knew what he had to do. Not to fight, but to surrender. Not to destroy, but to become. Very well, he said, his voice now completely devoid of emotion. Let the harvest begin. Chapter 13. Obsidian Bloom. The rain hadn't stopped. It hammered against the decaying stone of the castle, a relentless percussion mirroring the frantic beat of Hideo's heart. The air was thick with the scent of ash, ozone, and something else, something metallic and profoundly ancient, like unearthed bones touched by a forgotten god. Elias remained frozen, a statue carved from fear and nascent darkness, his eyes gleaming with that unnerving, unsettling light. Silvus, perched on a crumbling archway, observed him with a disconcerting patience. "You misunderstand," Silvus rasped, its voice a collection of shifting pebbles and whispering wind. "It's not a harvest, Ronin. It's a blossoming." Hideo tightened his grip on Cage Musha. The blade throbbed with an almost unbearable intensity, a tangible wave of corrupted power that threatened to overwhelm his senses. He forced himself to breathe, a ragged, shallow effort that did little to dispel the growing cold within him. The village, those fragile, resurrected souls, were huddled at the gates, their faces gaunt but alight with a hesitant hope. They didn't look at him with gratitude, not anymore. They looked at him with a strange, almost expectant reverence. "The process isn't finished," Silvus continued, its gaze fixed on Elias. "Malakor was merely a symptom, a particularly virulent strain of resistance. The darkness doesn't require a host. It requires a conduit. You, Hideo, are exceptionally suited." He turned his attention to Elias, a low, grim smile twisting his lips. The boy's fascination isn't simply curiosity. It's a resonance. He feels the pull, the potential. The power. Elias finally moved, a jerky, unnatural movement, like a marionette with frayed strings. He took a step towards Hideo, his hand outstretched as if to touch the blade. "It's beautiful," he whispered, the word laced with a disturbing eagerness. This freedom." Hideo didn't flinch. He recognized the insidious lure, the seductive promise of oblivion and boundless potential. Had spent years wrestling with this temptation, recognizing it as the very root of his damnation. Cage Musha pulsed, urging him forward, demanding a release. The blade was not a tool, it was a craving. "The shadows are not merciful," Hideo said, his voice a low rumble, stripped bare of all emotion. "They are not a solution. They are an echo of your own despair." He raised the blade higher, bathing Elias in its obsidian glow. "You think this is about saving people, boy. It's not. It's about accepting the inevitability of the fall." Elias reached out and grasped the hilt of Cage Musha. As his fingers closed around the worn leather, a visible wave of energy surged through him. His eyes widened, reflecting not just the blade's light, but a swirling vortex of shadow. A choked gasp escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. It's clear," he breathed, his voice gaining strength, becoming laced with the same unsettling resonance as Silvus. The patterns, the flowets, all so perfectly balanced. Hideo watched, a profound sense of detachment settling over him. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that he hadn't simply unleashed a weapon. He had unleashed himself. The blade hadn't taken him, it had him. The broken, the hollow, the relentlessly guilt-ridden man he had desperately tried to bury. "The void step," Sylvis murmured, a hint of something akin to approval in its voice. "A masterful application. The disruption of perception is key. It allows for the integration." A thin stream of dark energy began to flow from Elias' hand, coalescing into a shimmering, almost tangible form, a miniature raven, no bigger than Hideo's thumb. It circled him once, twice, before vanishing into the shadows. "The first bloom," Hideo said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. He knew what came next. The corruption wouldn't simply spread outwards, consuming the world around him. It would, fueled by the pain and suffering of others. It would find new vessels, new conduits. He turned to face the villagers, his expression a mask of chilling neutrality. "This land is not safe," he stated, his words carrying a weight of absolute certainty. "It will only ever be safe as long as darkness exists. And darkness, inevitably, will find a way." He stepped forward, extending his hand towards the raven that now rested on his palm. It pulsed with a dark energy that seemed to drain the very warmth from the air. "Join me," he whispered, the invitation a hollow promise. "Become one with the night." The rain intensified, washing over the castle, over Hideo, over Elias, over the nascent raven, a dark obsidian bloom in the heart of a dying world. He didn't fight it. He simply surrendered. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. Chapter 14. Obsidian Bloom. The rain, relentless and icy, hammered against the crumbling stone of the castle, mimicking the frantic rhythm of Hideo's pulse. The raven, now fully formed, perched on his hand, a miniature abyss reflecting the gloom. Its eyes, tiny pinpricks of swirling black, seemed to assess him with an unnerving intelligence, a judgment delivered in the silent language of shadows. Elias remained a silent observer, his face a study in detached fascination, the shimmering raven a testament to his arcane skill, and perhaps, Hideo thought with a chilling detachment, a mirror to his own descent. "It's accelerating," Elias finally said, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "The tendrils are thickening, the resonance's amplifying." He gestured to the raven with a slender hand, a gesture that held less curiosity and more a carefully measured calculation. "It's feeding on the residual grief, the lingering echoes of Malakor's atrocities. And it's learning." Hideo didn't respond, didn't move. The raven shifted slightly, its dark plumage rippling as if caught in an unseen current. He felt a pressure building behind his eyes, a sensation like an expanding void, threatening to swallow him whole. It wasn't pain, not precisely. It was a recognition of something vast and utterly indifferent, a hunger that stretched back beyond the ravaged province, across forgotten centuries, a darkness woven into the very fabric of existence. The villagers, gathered at the castle gates, were changing, not in a vibrant, triumphant way, but in a subtle, horrifying distortion. The color returned to their cheeks, yes, but it was a brittle, borrowed hue, like a painting applied to a decaying canvas. Their movements had become deliberate, almost robotic, reflecting a detached focus on the survival they were being granted. A few coughed, a disconcerting tremor running through their rebuilt frames, a phantom echo of the vitality Malakor had stolen. Hideo recognized the telltale signs. The raven wasn't simply eradicating the corruption, it was actively it. It was directing the stolen energy, not into healing, but into hardening, into reinforcing the nascent echoes of Malakor's influence. The villagers weren't merely recovering, they were being reshaped, molded into vessels receptive to the encroaching darkness. "It seeks patterns," Elias observed, his voice laced with a disturbing understanding. "It's not a random corruption. It's strategic. It remembers." Hideo considered this, the thought a cold shard of ice in his gut. He could almost feel the raven's awareness, a probing intelligence assessing his actions, weighing his intentions. It was a terrifying communion, a partnership forged in the crucible of despair. "The cycle is complete," he murmured, the words feeling ancient and profoundly wrong. "The raven, it is the seed. And the villagers, they are the soil." He raised his hand, the raven responding with a subtle tilt of its head. The air around them shimmered, thickening with the condensed darkness. The rain intensified, a deluge of obsidian water drumming against the castle walls, each drop carrying a fragment of the raven's hungry essence. "You believe you control it?" Elias asked, his voice devoid of mockery, yet laden with a quiet certainty. "You believe you're simply a vessel, channeling a force greater than yourself?" "You are profoundly mistaken." Hideo felt the shift within him, a loosening of his own will. It wasn't a forceful takeover, but a subtle, insidious erosion. The raven's influence was not a weapon, but a current, a slow, relentless flow that began to reshape his thoughts, to refine his desires. The urge to save, to protect was still there, buried beneath layers of cynicism and self-preservation. But it was now tempered by a cold, pragmatic understanding of the darkness' needs. He shifted his weight, cage musha humming in response, the blade's dark energy pulsing with an increased intensity. "I don't seek control," he stated, the words a carefully constructed lie. "I simply facilitate." He turned his gaze towards the villagers, their faces impassive, their eyes glazed with a strange, unsettling serenity. "Their gratitude is a tool," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. "A reinforcement. A catalyst for what is to come." He reached out, extending his hand towards the raven. "Let it spread," he commanded, the word less a directive and more an acknowledgement of an inevitable truth. "Let it weave itself into the very fabric of this land. Let it become comfortable." As his fingers brushed against the raven's obsidian feathers, a jolt of pure, unadulterated darkness surged through him. It wasn't a painful sensation, but a profound disorientation, a fleeting glimpse into the endless, uncaring expanse of the void. He saw the ripples of darkness spreading outwards, not just across the province, but across the world, touching everything, infecting everything. When the sensation subsided, he felt different. Not necessarily stronger, not necessarily more powerful, but subtly altered, the edges of his own identity blurring, dissolving into the encroaching darkness. The raven pulsed on his hand, and for the first time, Hideo didn't feel like a warrior fighting against the shadows. He felt like a part of them. "The cost," he said, his voice no longer his own, yet strangely familiar, "is everything." Chapter 15. The Obsidian Bloom. The rain had stopped, but the air remained thick with the scent of damp earth and something colder, something metallic that clung to the back of Hideo's throat. The villagers, now a vibrant, hesitant murmur, pressed closer to the castle gates, their faces reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight. Their gratitude wasn't the eager, desperate plea he had initially encountered. It was a quiet, almost reverent observation, as if they were studying a rare, unsettling bloom, a flower of black velvet and silent promise. He stood amidst them, cage musha gleaming with a subtly deeper sheen, the raven perched on his hand now pulsing with a low, rhythmic thrum. The blade felt less like a tool and more like an extension of a limb he barely recognized, a cold, dark echo of a man he was slowly losing. The echoes of Malakor's screams still resonated in his bones, a phantom chorus layered beneath the murmur of the villagers' voices. "It is done," he said, the words tasting of ash and regret. He hadn't intended to speak, not in this moment. It was a reflex, a corrupted mantra echoing the magus' final pronouncements. "The inconvenience has been resolved." A young woman, her face still pale, but with a nascent blush returning to her cheeks, stepped forward. You did not destroy us, Ronin. You merely redirected." He offered no response, simply turning his gaze to the raven. The bird tilted its head, obsidian eyes reflecting the faint light, as if considering the woman's words. It felt expectant. He wasn't sure if the feeling was his, or something else entirely weaving its way through his consciousness. "There is no merely," he finally said, his voice stripped of all inflection. The resonant murmur replaced by a monotone that chilled the air. "There is only the exchange. Life for resilience. The darkness seeks a foothold, and you have provided it. It will flourish." The villagers shifted uneasily. The unsettling serenity that had initially marked their faces was fracturing, replaced by a flicker of apprehension, a primal instinct for self-preservation. They were becoming accustomed to the darkness, integrating it into their very perception of reality. He started to move, not with the purposeful stride of a warrior, but with a slow, deliberate drift, like a shadow detaching itself from a wall. He wasn't heading towards the gates, but deeper into the castle, towards the heart of Malakor's corruption, a damp, stone-lined chamber where the magus had conducted his rituals, a place saturated with the residue of stolen life. As he progressed, he noticed subtle changes within the castle walls. The stone itself seemed to darken, absorbing the light, and a faint, viscous moisture clung to the walls. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of decay, and something indefinably hungry. It was a reflection of the raven, an amplification of the darkness head unleashed. In the chamber, a circle of obsidian tiles marked the epicenter of Malakor's power. The tiles pulsed faintly with the same dark energy that had fueled the magus ritual's a current of stolen vitality. He knelt, placing his hand upon the largest tile, Cage Musha resting beside him. The blade ignited with a blinding flash, not of light, but of pure, consuming darkness. This time, there was no surge of rage. This time there was understanding. He didn't feel the raven's influence as an imposition, but as an invitation. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that Malakor hadn't simply drained life, had been nurturing a seed, a parasitic entity that thrived on suffering and despair. The vital tithe hadn't just been a collection of bodies, it had been a carefully cultivated offering to this unseen force. He didn't destroy the energy. He absorbed it willingly, letting it flow through him, deepening the darkness within, rewriting the contours of his being. The pain was still present, a dull, insistent ache, but it wasn't the pain of loss, but the pain of becoming. "You were a shepherd," he said, his voice now utterly devoid of emotion, a hollow echo of his former self. "And I am the wolf." The raven pulsed violently against his hand, and for the first time, he felt a genuine sense of cold. It wasn't a joyful feeling, but a calm acceptance, a surrender to the inevitable. He extended his hand, and the raven launched itself into the air, spiraling upwards, a single point of darkness against the bruised sky. He watched it go, not with regret, not with fear, but with a detached curiosity. The villagers, still clustered around the castle gates, began to speak, not of gratitude, but of dreams. Vivid, unsettling dreams filled with shadows and whispers. Dreams of a world where hardship and suffering were not burdens, but necessities. The obsidian bloom was spreading, and they were absorbing its petals. Hideo turned away, walking deeper into the castle. He no longer felt like a warrior or a savior. He felt like a vessel, an empty shell filled with the chilling logic of the darkness. He was no longer fighting for the innocent. He was shaping them. And as he did, he realized, with a horrifying certainty, that the final hollow dawn wasn't a promise of redemption, but the beginning of a harvest.